I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, our special look at climate change. There's been some pretty extreme weather recently. Is climate change the culprit, and what sort of money is going into the cause and effects? Also in India, the cost of living is running higher than anywhere else in Asia. Interest rates are on the rise. Growth is likely to decline. We look at the people most affected. And Qatar's big Libyan adventure. But could it be a step too far for the little Gulf emirate as it seeks a bigger global role? So we're essentially looking at the weather this week, extreme weather, the role climate change is playing in it, and ultimately what it's costing us. Because the toll of severe weather patterns over the last 50 years has seen 800,000 people die and $1 trillion in economic losses, according to a report from the Economics of Climate Adaptation Working Group. And as long as there's no major movement on how to deal with climate change, people and livelihoods will continue to suffer. So we're kicking off with two case studies this week. Bolivia in a moment, but first South Africa, the 13th largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. And along the country's coast, local fishing communities are already seeing the effects.
Today's catch of abalone is disappointing. A year ago, they say they brought in a lot more than this. Fishing is in their blood. But increasing temperatures and the gradual rise in sea level is worrying.
The fish isn't there like it used to be seasonally. So you have to go quite far to go catch it, or you have to look here and there where they are. Because of the climate that changes, it's affecting the water. It's affecting the fish. It's affecting the whole sea, I think.
Some of these are destined for Europe and Asia. Each person has to bring in a certain amount of fish every season. The quota for crayfish is 603 kilograms by the end of June. If they don't catch enough fish, they may not make ends meet. Climate change is affecting the whole city. Cape Town's shoreline has changed dramatically with reclaimed land. More than 100 years ago, this was water. Some fear the sea could one day take back what belongs to it.
Where we're standing right now is where the sea levels, the sea level used to be in the 1940s. We are now standing on reclaimed land. So with rising sea levels, with changing temperatures, as well as the fact that right now, as you can see, we're having increased wind speed. Cape Town is one of those cities that will be affected directly by climate change.
Climate change activists say Cape Town's carbon emissions are said to be as high as that in London, New York and Beijing. It's affecting business. More cloud cover on Table Mountain means less tourists can visit. People are now being encouraged to change their lifestyle and ride bicycles to work. But it's a bustling city and a popular tourist destination. Convincing everyone to consider the environment could take time.
Luis Antonio Revilla, mayor of one of Latin America's poorest capital cities, says this is his #1 priority for 2011. Helping 1,300 families recover from landslides that destroyed everything they own. About 5,000 people have been living in camps like this one since February, scattered throughout the mountainous landscape of La Paz.
Every year, the rainy season in La Paz begins at the end of November, and it rains intensely. Before, it rained for 2 months in the city. With climate change, it's been raining as much as 4 months.
Some of those left homeless earlier this year are still living in donated tents. For now, there are hundreds of families living inside tents like this one. Up to 14 families live in one place like this. You see there's 7 families on each side. One family to each of these small beds that you see here. They say that during the day the sun makes it very hot inside here, and at night the temperatures drop to below 0 degrees. The mayor says with the proper resources it would take 20 years of structural work, like building canals and flood walls, to protect La Paz from future disasters.
We don't have the resources we need. We have some, which we're using to carry out some pilot projects. The problem is time.
These women are concerned that the humanitarian aid set aside for this year's landslide victims is set to run out in 3 months.
We need to find the energy to work, but we've lost our morale after what happened to us. All the families here are like that.
It's a difficult balancing act for Bolivia, juggling urgent problems like theirs with an array of other long-term development issues, all while knowing that in a few months the rains will begin again.
So Bolivia and South Africa there. Here's just 3 more examples of freaky weather conditions this year and the cost. In Queensland, Australia, floods covered an area the size of France and Germany, and they cost the economy about $30 billion. In southern and eastern China, droughts dried up reservoirs and rivers, but then last week heavy rain drenched the region, killing at least 52 and forcing more than 100,000 evacuations. And in North America, well, what a year it's been there, particularly all those tornadoes and twisters which wreaked havoc in Missouri. And on that topic, our meteorologist Steph Galt is at the video wall right now with more on the economic cost right across the US.
Kamal, we're only halfway through this year, but weather-wise it's been quite extraordinary across the United States, and there really is a cost to be counted. Here's our map of the United States, and this is just an indication of some of the areas that have been affected by all sorts of extreme weather. Most recently, we saw the tornado which devastated parts of Joplin, Missouri. This was the most deadly single tornado since 1947. Winds of 320 kilometers per hour caused between $1 and $3 billion worth of damage. Far more expensive is the flooding of the Mississippi River, which affected much of its length from Illinois southwards. The costs of aid, reconstruction, destroyed crops and lost business are estimated to be as much as $9 billion. Too much rain there, but towards the southwest, and Texas is suffering its worst drought in 44 years. Ranchers here have already spent $1.2 billion on high-priced feed for their animals, and the pastures are still unfit for grazing. This number is expected to rise when crop losses become known. Then, of course, there are all the tornadoes in April. Between the 3rd and the 5th, much of the southeast of the US was struck by severe storms, which are estimated to have cost $2 billion. Then round 2, which struck between the 8th and the 11th of the month. Some of the most destructive tornadoes from this were seen in Iowa. Another $2.25 billion. And the 2011 super outbreak that struck near the end of the month. This included the EF5, which ripped through Tuscaloosa. Over 300 tornadoes reported. It's one of the worst outbreaks in US history. The cost of this is likely to be between $3.5 and $6 billion. And finally, the winter storm, known as the Groundhog Day blizzard. This storm dumped 75 centimetres of snow in just one night. Road closures, cancelled flights and closed businesses are estimated to have cost between $1 and $4 billion. So, all up, worst case scenario, we're looking at around $27 to $28 billion worth of damage, and it may not stop there. A number of these disasters were triggered by the La Nina conditions. That's just the name given to a slight cooling of the surface waters of the Pacific, which affects the weather around the world. But even though that's over, Kamal, the hurricane season has now started, and this year it's supposed to be an active one.
Yeah, which begs the question, thank you, Steph, it begs the question how much more damage can be absorbed by these local economies year after year. Insurance giant Swiss Re has estimated that losses from natural disasters have risen from about $25 billion a year in the 1980s to $130 billion a year today. Little wonder then, if you want to draw a correlation, that spending on addressing the issue of climate change is up at $135 billion a year now and expected to rise, according to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Well, let's look at both those issues now. We mentioned Swiss Re a moment ago, and I'm delighted to say that Swiss Re's senior climate change advisor, Andreas Spiegel, is with us now from Zurich. And that in itself is interesting, Andreas, the fact that a reinsurance company like Swiss Re employs you specifically to advise on climate change. I guess it illustrates for us how big the issue is, financially speaking too.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, climate change is a top topic for the company. I mean, weather-related risks are our core business anyway. So the topic of climate change has been very important for the last 20 years already. We've published our first findings about climate change already back in '89. So yes, indeed, it's an important topic for a reinsurance company.
When you look at particularly prone areas, places like, say, the southern United States, where we see big hurricanes and tornadoes every year, and certainly this year has been exceptional. I mean, these are places, are they taking the right precautions? Are they understanding the enormity of it all? Are they taking the right insurance precautions, do you think?
Well, what we're seeing is basically that the economic losses from weather-related events and the insured losses as well are going up exponentially. Over the last 30 years, definitely. The main reasons for that is economic development, is the way we build our assets, where we tend to live at the moment very often in risky areas, in flood zones or in areas which are prone to tropical cyclone impacts. We could say basically that we put our assets at the moment at the very risky places, and obviously a lot more has to be done to improve resilience, to change that, and to improve regional planning and maybe building codes to reduce overall expected losses.
But again, further to that, and it goes back to my original point, do you think people in these places are understanding that? From a very simple perspective, you could look at some of these places and think, well, why live there? You know the enormous risk of natural disasters each and every year. Obviously, people do have to live somewhere, and they have to take this into account in everything they do and they plan.
Yeah, absolutely. In the end, it's a policy choice. It's a personal choice where to live and where to build the assets. As an reinsurance company, we basically put a price on the risk, and with this risk price tag, you can basically decide whether that still makes economic sense for you to live in these areas. Obviously, there are many different reasons why cities are built where they are, and for economic reasons, for social reasons, historical reasons, and we have to find ways to deal with that. On the other hand, what we also found in our studies is that there are many ways and measures to reduce the actual exposure to the impacts of weather events. So there's a lot more that can be done, and I think that should be the main focus over the next few years.
Okay, final thought then, Andreas, on what we started talking about in the first place, climate change. There are climate change talks that happen every year and that frankly don't achieve very much. In your expert and economic opinion, what needs to happen? What big decisions need to be made to get these climate change talks back on track and get the money going in the right place?
I think the topic overall is extremely complex, so we have to acknowledge that finding solutions which accommodate all the needs and issues involved for these countries, that's extremely difficult. What needs to happen definitely is that we need to agree on global emission reduction targets, the sooner the better, whether that is a global target to which every country can agree to, or whether it's national actions in line with global emission reduction goals. That would be another solution. But important is really that we agree on a quick and swift reduction of emissions as soon as possible.
Andreas Spiel with us from Zurich this week on Counting the Cost. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you very much.
And still to come on Counting the Cost, from Doha to Benghazi, we speak to the author of a special report on Qatar's involvement with Libya's pro-democracy movement. Right now, though, we're looking at inflation, a ticking time bomb for the growth of any economy. And right now, the big boomers, China, Brazil and India, are all experiencing the phenomenon. We'll look at Brazil in a moment, but first India, where the cost of living is higher than in any other major Asian economy. Prerna Suri looks at that.
Dinesh Gupta is worried. The numbers for his monthly budget aren't adding up and expenses seem to be skyrocketing. He's taken out a loan to buy his dream house, but even that looks uncertain right now.
My salary is fixed and is raised only once a year, but the interest for my loan keep rising. If this happens frequently, it's going to become very difficult.
The Guptas are among millions of Indians who are struggling to make ends meet. Surging prices for food and rising global oil prices has hurt almost everyone across the spectrum. Figures released this week show inflation is at a staggering 9.6%.
From food to fuel, almost everything in India is expensive right now. But the government, for its part, says that it has no choice but to pass on the price to consumers as it's reeling from global commodity prices. And the real challenge for policymakers here isn't just to bring down prices, it's to make sure that India's economic story continues as before. One way New Delhi is trying to tackle inflation is by hiking interest rates. On Thursday, it raised them again, the 10th time in the last 16 months. Experts say while hiking interest rates may slow down India's growth in the short term, it's what this country needs.
Consumer demand will be affected, investment will be affected, but that is a cost we have to now incur for bringing the inflation down. Because the inflation, once it is high, it could continue unless you tighten monetary policy.
For months now, people here have been living in the hope that inflation will soon stop eating into their pockets. But until that happens, millions will have no choice but to bear the cost of it.
And you know, it's not the most dissimilar situation in Brazil either, a country with strong growth but threatened by inflation. In fact, estimates for economic growth in Brazil have been halved this year because of that, while economic success has pushed the Brazilian currency, the real, up nearly 40% against the dollar. And throw on top of that interest rates, which are already the highest of any major world economy. Let's talk more about this with Carlos Caicedo, who is the head of Latin American forecasting at Exclusive Analysis in London. Carlos, thank you for your time. When we talk Brazil, we're usually talking growth and investment and big events. But it seems when you peel back the layers a bit, it might just be a bit too good to be true. Let's look at inflation first.
Well, it is a real concern for two reasons. For historical, and if you want to call it psychological reasons, the country has a history of hyperinflation. And I think the new governments and Brazilian policymakers had said never again. So that's why the central bank is so hawkish on interest rates. So even if that implies that the economy will slow down, I think the main view of policymakers in Brazil through the last 10 years has been we're going to keep inflation under control and we are not going back to the hyperinflation. So that's why you see how the central bank is reacting very quickly to this because, in fact, inflation has been outside the 4% target for a long, long time, and this is a serious concern. The only instrument they have at the moment is basically to increase interest rates, but it's a very difficult decision to make because at the same time, with high interest rate at such a level, it will only attract more and more portfolio capital and interest for foreign investors trying to make a buck in Brazil, and that will carry on appreciating the real. So it is a very difficult thing to do.
And that was the next point I was going to make, actually, about foreign interest, because Brazil has got all this oil, which is so valuable to its economy, but selling off the oil means you bring in a whole lot of US dollars, and it makes a mess of Brazil's own currency, the real.
Yes, indeed. But obviously, you need to consider that even before oil was discovered in Brazil, the currency was already on an appreciating trend. So if all the oil that has been promised by Brazil comes on stream, the estimates are 50 billion barrels, that will only exacerbate the appreciation of the currency. You will see more foreign investment coming into the country, and therefore the government will have to resort to different policies other than simply increasing interest rates. For example, it's quite likely that Brazil will become more protectionist to try to prevent unfair competition from foreign competition against domestic producers. So it is a very, very difficult issue, and I think you're going to have a very strong real for the next, at least for the foreseeable future.
Okay, then let's put a bit of a political slant on this, Carlos. I don't want to get too political, but all of this is coinciding with Dilma Rousseff becoming the president of Brazil. Do you think this was going to happen anyway? Would it have happened to Lula if he was still in charge? Was Brazil headed down this track anyway?
Yeah, I think one of the main features of Brazil is continuity of policy. You can see even a good number of the key policy makers of Lula stay in office. and there has been a clear continuity of that policy. So we shouldn't really talk about a major departure in terms of policy making. Possibly the difference you could see is President Dilma Rousseff being more supportive of big Brazilian companies, the so-called national champions, possibly a slight more interference of the state, but definitely what you are going to see or you have seen so far is continuity rather than a major shift in policy. So I don't think it would have been much different had Lula stayed in power.
All right, Carlos Caicedo from Exclusive Analysis talking Brazil with us. Thanks, Carlos.
You're welcome.
And finally, a story from our own backyard, Qatar, on the map because of, let's be honest, this network. Also the hosting of the World Cup in 2022 and all the controversy surrounding that. And now the nation's backing of Libya's pro-democracy movement. The question is, what's in it for Qatar? Regan Doherty is Reuters' Doha correspondent who's just filed a special report on Qatar's movements in Libya. We met up earlier this week for a chat.
So Regan, you stand here on the balcony of a five-star hotel in Doha. You see a skyline that wasn't there 5 years ago, and a man-made island that wasn't there maybe even 2 or 3 years ago, and you get an idea of how much money there is available in this country. And they've decided to put a whole lot into the rebels' camp, basically, in Libya. $64 million question, why?
Well, Qatar has intervened in many conflicts before, but never quite to this extent. So we wanted to look at what some of their motivations were and how they might stand to benefit strategically.
So what would you say number one motivations? Because the official line, if you like, is humanitarian assistance. This is a humanitarian situation, and they are providing humanitarian assistance. What's the number one thing, though, for you?
Well, they were very quick to respond to the severity of the humanitarian crisis in terms of supplying the most pressing needs, medicine, fuel, and food. But there are some other benefits, too. I think clearly having a presence in Libya will put them to a large benefit geographically, in the sense that they'll be right on the Mediterranean. They'll be that much closer to their future markets in Europe.
This is for natural gas, basically.
The gas, yeah.
Because essentially at the moment they're using tankers to move gas around. This, you feel, could be a new base, a new launching pad almost.
It could.
Into a new market.
It could. Libya also has a sovereign fund with some $70 billion in assets that are now frozen around the world. So presumably if the rebels were successful, Qatar would have a say in how some of that money is invested.
Why, though? What, is it just because of gratitude, if I can put it that way?
Libyans, I think, both in Libya and outside of the country are tremendously grateful to Qatar. And you really get a sense of that in Benghazi. Qatari flags everywhere and photos of the emir and billboards and posters everywhere. So I think the gratitude to Qatar in the future will be tremendous.
To that end, is there a risk involved? Maybe not so much in backing the wrong horse, but you've pointed out that they've gone out so strong and intervened so strongly in this case. Is there a risk involved there for the state?
I think certainly there is, in that an intervention of this scale increases Qatar's risk profile in terms of other people who might be viewing internationally. But the potential benefits are tremendous.
When all this is over, I say when because it has to be over at some point, there's going to be some serious spoils, if I can say, to be divided. And it's going to be the rebels, if they win, who have to sit down and figure out how to divvy this up. I mean, there have been Western oil companies in there for a long time. Then you get a player like Qatar coming in now. How does it get divided up, do you think?
Well, I think Libya is certainly different from Iraq in the sense that you're unlikely to have a protracted civil war there. Once it is all over, there'll be a much more definitive end. And since, as you say, oil production has essentially ground to a halt in the east, I think Qatar will have a real first-mover advantage in the sense that the Libyans will remember and be tremendously grateful.
Because there was already that big shipment that was talked about, a tanker that was sent in. I mean, how much did that sort of help and lift the spirits, if you like?
I think it helped a great deal, and I think it hasn't stopped since that first shipment in terms of that and in terms of other diesel and other supplies.
Regan, it's been great talking to you, thank you, and maybe when and if all this is over, we'll have another chat and see how much of this comes true or not.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And that is about our lot for this week, but don't forget counting the cost online. You start at the main page at aljazeera.net/English. You hit the business tab at the top, and there's a link from there to the Counting the Cost page, where we put all our episodes up in full for you to catch up on whenever you want. And then when you want to get in touch, you hop on Twitter, search for Kamal AJE, where I post regular updates on the show. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.